We know that Rashi focuses on Pshat, the simplest understanding of the Psukim, and he doesn't typically bring a Medrash unless that helps us understand the Pshat, the simple understanding, better. And yet in this week's parasha, on 2 occasions, it appears as if Rashi is coming from a perspective that is not so much the Pshat. The Rebbe has explained multiple times that Rashi's purpose in explaining the Torah is the first Pshutei Shel Mikra, to explain the simplest understanding of the pasuk. Rashi himself tells us many times in his commentary. And if Rashi brings something which is non-literal, a medrash and haggadah, the reason he does it is, as Rashi himself tells us, he tells us, my job over here is to tell you the simple understanding of the psukim. And I'll quote an haggadah in order to satisfy or to help us understand the pshat, the simple understanding of the pasuk. Dover al oifnov. Each concept spelled out or expressed in its particular way. In other words, Rashi means that Rashi will only bring something which is haggadah if either there is something in the pasuk that is unclear and the medrash will clarify the pshat, or and secondly, the medrash actually has to do that. It actually has to help us clarify what we wouldn't have understood about the pshat. But whereas if there's a place where the pasuk could be understood at face value, without any challenges or misunderstandings, and Rashi maybe haggadah, then Rashi is not going to introduce a medrash. So if I could understand the pasuk, I don't need a medrash, Rashi is not going to bring it. And even if the medrash is going to give us a better insight into the language or the expression of the pasuk, still, if there's no question, if there's no issue with the pshat, Rashi is not introducing an haggadah. And that's why there's a big question around a pasuk in our parasha. Where you find that most of the commentaries that go the pshat route, they explain this pasuk according to its simplest understanding, whereas Rashi is the only one who seems to specifically explain it according to a medrashic kind of an approach. Where is that? We know that Bilam early on starts to praise the Jewish people. One of the first things that he says in our praise is, the pasuk says, I see him from the head of peaks, and I notice him, referring to the Jewish people, from the hills. They are a nation who dwells alone. So Hapashton in the ones who explain pshat of the pasuk, which is Eben Ezer, Rashbam, Ramban, Ralbag, Ve'oid. They explain when Bilam says, I see them from the top of the peaks, that is literal. At that point, Bilam was standing on the summit of the mountain, and he saw the Eden from that point. And when he saw them, he started to praise them. Then the praises begin. They're a nation who dwells alone, they're unique, etc. In other words, top of the mountain means top of the mountain. But Rashi quotes those words out of the pasuk as his header. I see them from the tops of the mountains. So and he explains something which is basically what the medrash says. Bilam is saying, I look at the beginning of the history and I look at the root of this nation. And I see that they are strong and established like these powerful peaks and hills, because of their forebears, their matriarchs and patriarchs. Doesn't seem to make any sense. Why does Rashi ignore the simple explanation that Bilam was standing on a mountain, which he was, and instead explain these words according to a midrashic perspective? Okay, but some of the commentators on Rashi want to explain that there is a difficulty in translating this literally that he's on a mountain, which is, what's the question? Why does the pasuk have to tell us where Bilam was standing when he made these comments? ועל פה המסקנה מדרש, הכוסף מדרש, שגם הנאמר מריש צורים בגוימר, חלק מהשבוחים שיוצאים מפי בילעם כלפי בני ישראל. And therefore the Medrash wants to say, and apparently Rashi is doing the same, that when it says that he sees them from the mountains, it's actually part of the praise he's giving them, rather than the Torah showing us his geographical location, which isn't necessary information for us. But the truth is, the fact that the Torah identifies where Bilam is standing, it's not such a problematic issue according to Pshat. In fact, there's a compelling reason according to the Pshat why the Torah has to tell us where he's standing. When you watch the flow of the psukim, it actually seems to lend itself to a literal explanation that he's standing on a mountain. Why so? Because when Bilam finishes his first soliloquy, which is full of praise and brachas for the Yidden, Balak is upset, and he says to Bilam, what have you done to me? I hired you to curse, and you've blessed instead. And therefore he says, let's go to a different location. From there you'll see them. Maybe from there you'll see part and not the whole of the nation, and that will influence your outlook, and you'll curse them. So the pasuk is positioning things that Balak feels Bilam blessed the people because he saw the whole nation, and he wants to change it. He wants to give him like an angle, like a perspective. So where did the pasuk tell us that he saw everybody? The pasuk actually seems to indicate that the place, Bamois Baal, where Balak took Bilam, is a place that could only see the edge of the nation. Whereas if we read our pasuk as pshat, that he was standing on the top of a mountain, literally, then there's no question. Bilam in his expression, in his praise, said, I see them from the top of the mountain. He said that by way of introduction, and almost alluding to why they are brachas, because I see them from this bird's eye view, and that would explain why Balak wants to now move him somewhere else. Which means that the pshat of saying he's literally standing on top of a mountain is the best way to explain the flow of the psukim. In which case, why would Rashi have to explain it anywhere in any other way other than the pshat? The pshat works perfectly, beautifully. Before we explain that, let's just analyze the language Rashi uses and compare it to what appears to be his source in the Medrash. We have to understand Rashi's language. Rashi's source that the mountains we're describing over here are the Avos and the Imohos, and that gave the Jewish people strength. That comes from a Medrash. Except Abal Sham Aloshan He, the Medrash says the same principle but in completely different words. There it says Merush Kimerosh Surim Elu Avos. The head of the peaks refers to our patriarchs. Umigvois Elu Imohos, and the hills, they refer to our matriarchs. And that's not a surprise that the Medrash should refer to the Avos as mountains, because there are psukim that refer to them as mountains. Oitzur, or peaks. Like the pasuk in Yeshai that says, look at the peak that you were hewn out of. And immediately says, look to Avram Avinu, implying that Avram Avinu equals a peak of a mountain. In that case, when you move on, that's going to raise some questions for us. Why is Rashi using the expression that we get strength from the Avos and Imohos, rather than saying, as the Medrash does, that the mountains are the Avos and Imohos? Why doesn't Rashi give us any basis in a pasuk to tell us that the Avos and Imohos are compared to mountains? Because had Rashi actually brought a pasuk that illustrates the Avos and Imohos are compared to mountains, That would have strengthened the fact. Remember, Rashi quotes a medrash if it is going to clarify or settle the words in the pasuk. So, if the medrash is describing the Avos and Imohis as mountains, and I have a pasuk to prove that, well, the pasuk is going to show me then that the medrash is suited to the pshat of the pasuk. But when you pay close attention to the choice of language that Rashi uses, so then what you're going to notice is that he says, Ki adrabah, Rashi achem bo kan l'shanos l'farish lo kamei medrash shirish tzurim eli avos impois eli mohis. That Rashi is actually using a different, he's coming from a different perspective, a different angle to what the Medrash was saying. The Medrash wanted us to know that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarif, Korach, Holaneah, they are the mountains on which we stand. At a kediktik l'shoner Rashi, Rashi is not saying that. Rather, he's saying, I'm looking at them, the root of the Jewish people, the foundation of the Jewish people. And I see them, the Jewish people, and the Jewish people are strong as mountains. Not that their ancestors are strong as mountains. Pirish, in other words, what Rashi is telling us is that the Jewish people are those who are powerful like the mountains. And the Aves and Imois are the heads, meaning the source, the root, the base of those mountains. They are the roots of the Jewish people, who allowed us to become powerful people. Which is why Rashi says that our strength comes through the Aves and Imois, not that the mountains of our strength are the Aves and Imois. Claiming, in other words, is not saying like the Medrash that the mountains are the fathers and mothers. Rather, he's saying that we, the Jewish people, have incredible power, like the power of these great cliffs and great peaks. And where do we get it from? The Avos and Imois. The only thing is that still leaves something unclear, which is the whole gufa time boy. This too needs to be explained. Seeing as Rashi clearly is not saying the pshat, that it's talking about Bilam standing on a mountain, rather that the mountain represents something, and that the pasuk is describing the power of the Jewish people relative to where we come from, our fathers and mothers. So if that's the case, why is he saying it differently to the Medrash? Why doesn't he say, like the Medrash, that the peaks refer to the forefathers? Especially if there's a pasuk to base that on, look at the stone you were hewed from, which is Avraham Avinu. Why has Rashi chosen to explain differently that the mountains and peaks refer to the Jewish people, whereas our forefathers are only considered the head of or the root of the mountains? The way we're going to explain this is Rashi's identifying something in the pasuk that has not yet been addressed, and this will not only apply in this pasuk, but we're going to use another example in Bilam's curses come blessings, where the same message applies. The Torah, by way of introduction to Bilam's statement, says, he began his mashal by saying, Rashi does not explain that word mishaloi, which means that Rashi obviously believes you take that word at face value, which is Bilam diber kan b'mashal, that Bilam was speaking over here in a metaphoric way. We know that the meaning of a mashal, a metaphor, is there's something which is similar to and relates to and represents something else. As we see in the next 3 times that Bilam is going to speak, which are also all introduced with this expression, all of the expressions of praise that Bilam used around the Jewish people were all metaphoric. Like the horns of the Re'im. It's obviously representing something about our strength. Like a cub, like a lion. Like streams, like gardeners. A star that shoots out All of those things are clearly metaphoric. That's mishaloi, that's a mashal. So look for mashal, look for metaphors in what Bilam is saying. In our pasuk, then the question is, what of what Bilam said over here is metaphoric? The first part that he says, Min aram yancheni Balak gomer l'chol gomer ma ekov gomer. The fact that he talks about how Balak hired him and said, go curse the Jews, and he said he couldn't unless Hashem empowered him to. In a mashal, that's not metaphoric. That is a report of things that actually happened. And the bracha that follows, they're a nation who dwells alone, and are not counted amongst the nations. In a mashal, that's not metaphoric, that's literal. So where's the mashal in Bilam's words? Now, maybe the mashal is coming in the next pasuk, where Bilam says, Mi mona afar Yaakov, who could count the dust of Yaakov, who could pirish HaMefarshim, like the Mefarshim explained, Shakavonahi, Shemipasri Buyim, or Otzam, Shel Bnei Yisrael Yefshadim Noisam, that because the Jewish people are so numerous, you can't count them. And that is like the metaphor of sand, where there's so much sand, you can't count it. Like David promised Avraham Avinu, I'm going to make your descendants so numerous that people can't count them like they cannot count the sand. Maybe that's the mashal in the story. Except that when Rashi explains those words, he clearly illustrates that they're not intended to be metaphoric. Maybe Rashi brings two explanations of what it means, who could count the sand of Yaakov. So in his first explanation he says that the word afar actually means the children of Yaakov. Meaning that in this pasuk, the sand is not intended as a metaphor for the size of the Jewish people, to illustrate how many Jews there are, but rather like small grains of sand are the small children of Yaakov. In other words, it's not metaphoric. That's because the word afar, which is related to the word afruris, which actually means small particles of sand or dust, is a reason why we use that word sometimes to refer to little babies, because like sand are small particles, children are small. Or the word over here of afruris is related to the word oifer ha'yolim, which refers to a young animal, a young stag, as they call it, which is a kind of an antelope, a gazelle. But the meaning is that in that word afar is the meaning for the word young. You don't need a metaphor. And Rashi's second explanation for sure negates the possibility that it's a metaphor, because he says that the word sand over here talks about mitzvahs that we do related to sand, like not planting kilayim or not pulling a plow with the two different species of animals. He talks about the afar soita, etc., different examples of mitzvahs that are associated with sand, which means sand is literal. That way you're translating the word afar in its most literal sense. You're actually talking about sand. Afar mamish. Except what sand are we talking about? Sand that is involved in mitzvahs. So therefore, Rashi negated the possibility that afar is a metaphor. And likewise, the next words in that pasuk, which is, and to count the Roiva Yisrael. Roiva Yisrael is not a metaphor. Rashi again gives two explanations. Either it's referring to the fact that Roiva means the four quadrants of the Jewish camp, and his second explanation is that the word Roiva comes from the word to give birth, which is Revi Oisehen. Again, literal, not metaphoric. So where's the Meshaloi in this section of what Bilam is speaking about? The only words in this section that Bilam is saying that could be interpreted as a metaphor are the words that I see them from the top of the mountains. That's why Rashi did not want to go with the angle that here is a literal explanation of Bilam standing on a mountain. Rather, he wanted to bring a mashal, a medrash, which is meyashiv, which clarifies the words of the psukim, and that I see them from their source, and I see that they are strong and settled, established like mountains. So, al pi ha'omer, with that insight, that what's driving Rashi is that he has to explain that these words Merish Tzurim are the metaphoric part of what Bilam is saying. That will also explain that while Rashi is speaking similarly to the Medrash, he's not saying the same thing as the Medrash, that the mountains equal our forefathers, even though there are other psukim that refer to the Avos as mountains. Why? Because seeing as the word tzurim is, according to the Medrash, sometimes used in the Torah as a reference specifically to the Avos, well, then it's no longer a metaphor. It's an expression used in Torah. That is the expression the Torah employs to refer to the Avos. That's not a mashal. Rashi is looking for a mashal. Therefore, Rashi had to conclude that the reference to hills and mountains are used by the Torah over here, or by Bilam over here, as a mashal to represent the strength of the Jewish people, that they are a nation powerful like the immutable mountains that nobody could destroy. With that insight, we can visit another commentary that Rashi makes on another part of Bilam's prophecies that also seems to be unusual, and that's Basim Nevuas Bilam at the end of Bilam's Nevuah, where he says, there he says that Amalek is the first of the Goyim. Pirish Rashi explains that means who kodam es kulam lilachem b'Yisrael. He preempted an attack on the Jewish people before any other nation. And then Rashi continues to quote from Unclus that in the future Amalek will be destroyed at the hands of the Jewish people. As the pasuk in Parshas Kisei, it tells us Timche ezecha Amalek, that you should eradicate the memory of Amalek. Now, but we have a similar question here. Aleph, number one. What is then the pshat that drives us to say that Amalek is the first of the nations means first to attack us? That he preempted everybody else to attack the Jewish people. Why doesn't Rashi explain it? Why doesn't he explain it simply, according to Pshat, as the Ramban points out, which is that Amalek is considered like the top of all the nations, the first tier nation, because they were very powerful and they were warriors. And that is Reishis L'Shain Mishubach. That would be using the word Reishis as the Torah does elsewhere as an expression of greatness. Like Rashi pointed out when it came to the Keteres, that you had to take Besamim Roish, fragrances of Roish. What does Roish mean? Rashi says, important. So why don't we say Reishis Goy means the most important of the nations? Why are we saying no? The nation that first attacked the Jewish people. Second of all, Beis. Why is Rashi quoting a proof that will destroy Amalek at some point from a pasuk that we haven't yet learned? Because generally Rashi does not like to refer to information we haven't yet learned. Amalek, which is written in Parshas Kisei, when he could have used a different pasuk. Why doesn't he quote a pasuk we learned earlier in Parshas Beshalach? Where the Eibushter says, I will surely eradicate any memory of Amalek. Now, the answer to the second question we could possibly say very simply is because Rashi's point over here is that Amalek will be destroyed at the hands of the Jewish people. That would explain why he brought a pasuk that's speaking about you, the Jewish people, will destroy Amalek in the future, the pasuk in Kiseitze. The only thing is, that too doesn't make sense. Why does Rashi have to say who's going to destroy Amalek anyway? It's not relevant to our pasuk. And that forced him then to have to quote the pasuk Timche. Who cares who's destroying Amalek? The prophecy is Amalek will be destroyed. Read the words of the pasuk. Doesn't it say the end of Amalek is destruction? The pasuk doesn't allude to who will destroy them. And so it would be a satisfactory way to explain this pasuk to say they will destroy them based on the pasuk we already learned, we're familiar with from Parshas Beshalach. So Maharal Kosef Levoer, the Maharal explains that the words Adei Oived cannot be like some kind of auto-destruction. Because if it says the beginning of nations is Amalek, whether that means they're the strongest, most powerful, or whether that means the first to attack us, and then you just say, and at the end they will disappear, what's the link? And therefore the Maharal wants to say Rashi needed to link it. They were the first to attack us, and therefore we will destroy them, not just they will be destroyed. And the Maspik, but the Rebbe is not completely satisfied with that answer. What's to force us to say that just because the beginning of the story that Rashi is referring to over here, they were the first to attack us, that has to do with them attacking us? Means the only way you could ever explain the destruction is that the Jews have to destroy them? Who says? You could explain really simply, seeing as Amalek was the first nation to attack us, they deserve destruction. Which means they should be completely eradicated from the world. In fact, Bilam says something similar about other nations as well, without telling us who destroys them. It's because you attack the Jewish people, you deserve to be destroyed. But the explanation is exactly along the lines of the first explanation we gave, which is, where's the metaphor in what Bilam is saying? Here the pasuk starts off by saying that Bilam saw Amalek, and then he started his mashal and said that they're the first of the nations. So Rashi finds this weird. Where's the metaphor in this pasuk? To tell us that Amalek qualifies as Reishis Goyim, self-understood. Amalek is the greatest, most powerful, most militarily capable of all the nations. Okay? And the pasuk then says, and at the end they'll be destroyed. Okay, also pshat, there's no metaphor in that. Therefore Rashi has to say, actually in those words, Reishis Goyim Amalek, that's to be something which is metaphoric, namely, that Amalek took the lead to be the first nation to attack the Jewish people. Rashi is immediately identifying that describing Amalek over here as the first of nations is not the normal way we describe first, as in best, greatest, most powerful. This is telling us something completely different about Amalek, information that will not be detected in the simple understanding of the pasuk. The simple understanding, powerful, great nation. Rather, Rashi says there's a metaphor, Reishis Goyim Roi Mislekach. The fact that they're called Reishis Goyim, that alludes to, because that's what a metaphor does, it alludes to something else. Which is, they were the first to attack the Jewish people. And that explains why Bilam started this by saying, Mashallah. I'm not going to speak just literally. I'm going to allude to something that happened. Which also explains why Rashi insists that we need to know not only that Amalek will be destroyed, but specifically destroyed at the hands of the Jewish people. Because Reishis Goyim Amalek speaks to a specific message. And that specific message is associated with the Jewish people. They attacked us. So then their destruction that will follow, it makes sense. It's not just to tell us at the end Amalek will be destroyed. It's also a mashal, meaning it's telling us more information than what is apparent. What's more information? It's more information that's apparent that we're the ones who are going to destroy them. Once we know beginning and end over here are not just literal first and last. So if both words are a mashal, they must link. They must be speaking the same theme, which is we're describing the beginning and the end of a particular theme, a particular event, which is Milchemes Amalek v'Yisrael, the fight, the war between Amalek and Yisrael. So Reishis, they started the war before any other nation. Achris, at the end, we will destroy them, and potentially more than any other nation. That's how Rashi explains. The end is at our hands. Because Rashi wants us to know that the end rounds off a story that began right at the beginning. Amalek was first to take us in battle. They the ones who ambushed us, they're the ones who started up with us. And that war is going to continue all the way until the end when we eradicate them. Let's go back to the first comment that Rashi said, which is Merosh Tzurim, that the mountains are a mashal for the strength of the Jewish people. There's a beautiful depth of insight in this. Generally, you only need a mashal, a metaphor, if what you're trying to explain is very deep and profound. Which means what you're trying to explain is beyond explanation. That's why you're using a mashal to explain what's going to go over people's heads. In other words, we find something that is relatable, that is understandable, that conveys the same kind of message that the nimshal it's supposed to represent is looking to convey. So thanks to the mashal, we can get understanding, or at least some understanding of the nimshal. But there's something it applies in our case here too. Saying that we are powerful like mountains is obviously metaphoric. Because the truth is, our true strength that is built in, that is wired into us because of our forefathers, is nothing like the power of mountains. Interesting, it said Balak should be Bilam. Bilam has no way to describe the kind of strength that the Jewish people have. So Bilam is speaking to Balak. Balak is not going to be able to understand the greatness of the Jewish people. So Bilam has to provide him with a mashal that maybe he'll be able to wrap his head around. They're powerful like mountains. The power is way beyond mountains, fundamentally beyond mountains. And that's because our true strength is not physical like the hands of Esav. The power of the body, the power of physical strength. Our strength is spiritual, it's the power of our neshama. Most specifically, the greatest power we have is our capacity for Mesiras Nefesh. And Mesiras Nefesh is able to overtake every faculty of the body, including the physical. Because when a person has Mesiras Nefesh, they give everything to the Eibishter. To talk in the language of soul levels, that Tzemach Tzedek explains, Rosh Tzurim, the peaks of mountains, that is a representation of the part of our neshama that allows us the capacity to completely sacrifice for Hashem without any rational basis. That's why it's called the peak of the mountain, because it is an incredibly powerful part of who we are. Meaning, what is our real strength? Faith in Hashem. And because of that faith, we are willing to sacrifice everything, not to chas v'shalom reject Hashem. In fact, it becomes impossible for us. It's not just that we won't, we're unprepared, we refuse to give up on Hashem. We cannot. We just simply cannot. That's why Rashi says, Bilam was saying, I look at their beginnings, and I see that they are established and powerful, thanks to, or through the Avos and Imois. Because the fact that you didn't have such an immutable faith in Hashem is something that we earned or were given through the Avos and Imois, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. And the strength that we have as Yidden to commit to Hashem is the opposite of conventional strength as perceived by the world. The definition of the world is things which are tangible, things which exist, things which have an ego. Which means in the physical world, in order for something to be powerful, it has to be very present, it has to be very tangible. Whereas Mesiras Nefesh is the exact opposite, that the person completely surrenders themselves and completely hands themselves over to Hashem, the opposite of conventional strength, and yet the source of the greatest strength. That's what the Alter Rebbe explains. Where do we gain this opportunity, this potential for absolute Mesiras Nefesh? It's from the Hashem Echad that is radiant in our neshamas. Because our neshamas are a piece of Hashem, literally a piece of Hashem. It's because of who we are, because our makeup is divine. Naturally, we have faith. Naturally, we have Mesiras Nefesh. Because Mesiras Nefesh is the opposite of the natural position of any created entity. It is illogical. It goes against the grain. People will do anything to preserve life. A created being cannot embrace something that means disappear. It means lose yourself. In order to do that, we have to have divine resource, which is our neshama. This is the deeper meaning of the pasuk, which is that I see them from the top of the mountains. They're a nation who dwells alone and not counted amongst other nations. Because of our unique ability to have this Mesiras Nefesh to Hashem, therefore we are alone. We're alone in the sense that we're in a completely different level. We're completely elevated from the rest of the nations. This is what Rashi is telling us. I see them at their source. I see that they're strong. I see that they're established because of the fathers and mothers. That the power of conviction that our forefathers and foremothers had is part and parcel of who we are. It was transmitted through the generations without even being diluted. Were you to describe strength, which is normal, natural strength, it's not possible to transmit that strength, certainly not in the same degree from one generation to the next, because the nature of things is that as time progresses, so they weaken. But if the strength that we have is because of the Eibishter's koyach, because Hashem Echad radiates inside of ourselves, and that's what our Avos and Imois had, and they then bequeathed it to us. In other words, they hardwired it into our system. It doesn't ever change because it's divine, eternal energy. And that power is transmitted through the generations to every single Jewish person, in a way that it will never waver, it will never alter. So we have the strength to be able to stand up to any challenge that comes our way and to be completely dedicated to Hashem at all costs, at all times.